right? So you could take a standard contract that is written up, that has stood the test of time, and you could point to a particular feature or particular rule in that contract and ask 10 different attorneys what their opinion is on that rule, and it's a very real likelihood you get 10 different answers. Right? There's always like the little tweaks and words that they can find to kind of change the entire meaning or intent behind that particular paragraph or sentence, and that's where you can really run into issues or problems. One thing. Welcome to the Home Goals Podcast, the ultimate guide for turning your home goals into a reality. I'm your host, Derek Thornton. Join us as we navigate the twists and turns of obtaining a home. We'll be offering expert tips, helping you avoid pitfalls, and championing your journey towards that cherished place to call home. In this week's episode, we are going to be discussing real estate contracts and what every buyer and seller should know, even if you have an agent. I cannot stress the importance of all the different real estate contracts and addendums and disclosures and all the different things that are out there, and how confusing it can be even for agents to understand a lot of this stuff. And so I wanted to give some tips and advice for helping you kind of navigate understanding these things, that these legal documents that you're signing that are likely for one of the biggest transactions you'll have in your lifetime. You want to make sure you kind of have an understanding of what you're getting yourself into. And so I wanted to take some time to discuss it. And now is as good a time as any, because in our state, North Carolina, every July, our real estate commission and their forms committee, they release all the changes that they have to the forms and contracts that we typically use. So it's different for every state. So it's not the same for everybody. But in our state, we have our North Carolina Realtors Association has standard forms and contracts that most of us all use in any of our transactions. And that's for anywhere in the state of North Carolina, right? And so if you're buying a house in Wilmington or in Asheville or in Raleigh, they're all often using the exact same contract. The only time that's really different in our state is if you're doing like a new construction deal, because a lot of those builders usually have their own forms that they like to use. But any resale home, it's a solid chance that you're going to be using one of these standard forms that our Realtor Association releases. And every year, it never fails, there's something that goes wrong that happens in a transaction where things just blow up, and there's lawsuits and all kinds of things going on, and errors and omissions insurance is getting thrown into the mix, right? And there's all these different things that are happening. And when those problems arise, first thing they say is like, hey, we might need to revise or make some changes to our contract. And so every single year, there's always some change to those contracts and forms. It may not be a huge change. It may be the whole document changes. It could be anything that goes on, right? I used to always joke that every year I was in the business, the forms and contracts just kept getting longer and longer. When I first started, the offer to purchase that we used, the standard contract, it was 11 pages long. All the way up until last year, it had gotten up to 17 pages long, right? They kept adding stuff because, again, stuff would happen in a transaction or deal, and they're like, we need to add that into our contracts and forms. Now, there were huge sweeping changes that happened in the real estate industry last year that caused them to kind of break from their traditional course of things, and now they made more changes even more often than the annual July one that they typically do, right? And so there are some forms we have that were updated in October, some that were updated in January, and even more changes that are happening. One of the positive things to all the things that happened last year is that they realized that there was a lot of confusion surrounding some of the forms and legalese and everything like that. And so they were trying to find ways to simplify things, which is a huge help. And that has actually caused them to reduce a lot of the forms and contracts that we've been using. So it's been a welcome change from my standpoint, because now instead of a 17-page contract, it's now getting bumped down to 14 pages, right? Now instead of a 13-page listing agreement, now it's being bumped down to 7. Right. So those changes have been very helpful in just kind of helping to simplify the process. Real estate is already complicated enough. We didn't need a ton of things like that. Trying to explain all of that to every single client is extremely difficult, right? Because, we're all human. We all have short attention spans, and it's difficult to go through all of those different contracts and documents and make sure that your client is actually retaining the information in there. And so that's been a welcome change that I've noticed in the past year or so, is that we have started to kind of simplify a lot of our documents and stuff. And I don't want you to think that you need to become an expert on all of these forms and disclosures and changes. That's what you hire me for. That's what you hire a realtor to be in your corner. You hire us to be the expert because we're in this stuff all the time. So I don't expect you to know the ins and outs of all these different documents. However, I do think that you need at least a general understanding of what you're getting into and what is at risk and what things can happen and how you understand that. And so you should be asking questions all along the way, making sure that you are working with a realtor who can explain the process to you. You never want to work with somebody who's just do what I tell you to do and you'll be good to go. No, they're not the one that's paying the bill on that mortgage. They're not the ones that's going to be living in that house. You need to make sure that you have a general understanding of what you're getting into, what risk you're taking. No matter what you do, there is no such thing as a risk or stress-free deal. There's always risk. There's always going to be some level of stress involved in there. And so you just want to make sure that you have as much information as you can reasonably and still be able to move forward in that transaction, right? And so understanding what all is in there. So one of the biggest things that you need to understand or have a general overview of is what is in that contract, or what is that contract binding you to do, right? So what funds do I have to put up to be able to get this house under contract? What funds am I going to be expected to pay? What things are optional? Which things are required? And more importantly, when I give those funds up, what is my recourse for getting it back if things go south, right? So there's some things like a due diligence fee in our state where technically it does come back to you on the back end if that deal closes successfully. There are other things like paying for a home inspection or paying for an appraisal that are things that you would need to do. Those funds do not come back to you, right? You're paying for those services, and those funds do not come back to you in any way, shape, or form. And so if that deal doesn't close, you just lose those funds. Right. There's some rare instances where you might be able to get a due diligence feedback. Maybe if there was a permitting issue that wasn't disclosed or material fact or something that changed in there. But again, you want to have an understanding of, okay, what are the key features or key things that could happen that could cause me to lose those funds and not be able to recoup them? That's what you want to have a firm understanding and a firm grasp of. And that's one of the things when I'm doing my first consultation with the buyer or seller, that's when I'm explaining to them. I'm saying, hey, here's what's at risk in the deal. Here's the money that you're having to put up to get this house on the market or to get this house under contract. Here's what you stand to lose. It's also important not only for you to understand what you can recoup, but what the contract says about your ability to recoup that. One thing that I have learned the hard way over the years is that just because the contract says something doesn't automatically mean that that's the way that it's always going to work anytime you have a transaction or a deal going. You could ask, or it was attorneys, I should say. It's attorneys that wrote the contracts and forms that we use, right? And so that's the important thing to keep in mind, is that it's not realtors. We're not allowed to draft addendums of contracts, and nor should we try to, because again, that's not our area of expertise. We should leave that to the lawyers. They're the ones who write it up. The good thing about that is that no one's better at writing up a solid contract than a quality attorney. The downside to that is that there is no one more equipped to find loopholes in said contract than an attorney. Right. So you could take a standard contract that is written up, that has stood the test of time, and you could point to a particular feature or particular rule in that contract and ask 10 different attorneys what their opinion is on that rule. And it's a very real likelihood you get 10 different answers, right? Because attorneys are always saying, well, this contract that said shall, but it didn't say would, or it didn't say will, right? There's always like the little tweaks and words that they can find to kind of change the entire meaning or intent behind that particular paragraph or sentence. And that's where you can really run into issues or problems. One thing that I have seen come up in the past and that has really caused issues for me, and something that I constantly warn my clients about, in our standard purchase contract, we have something that's called an earnest money deposit. And those are funds that are typically sitting in a trust account, in the attorney's trust account. And that money comes from the buyer. And the only way, based on the contract, the only way that the seller would have the ability to access those funds or have a right to those funds is if the buyer backs out of the deal after a agreed upon date for their due diligence, right? And so if they say, hey, we need, or we're requesting to have 21 days to be able to do all of our inspections and everything like that. And then once that deadline passes, if we're still in the deal, if we back out after that point and waste even more of your time, seller, we will allow you, or the contract says that you are now due the earnest money deposit as well. So there's been deals that I've had in the past where it was very clearly stated that, hey, if the buyer backs out before this point, they're due a refund of that earnest money deposit. And there were deals where a buyer did just that. They got the home under contract. They saw something in the inspection they didn't like. Maybe the appraisal issue kind of caused a breakdown in the negotiations. Or for whatever reason, that deal fell apart. And the buyer backed out before the due diligence period, right? So they followed what the contract said. They should be due that earnest money deposit. But what we found out is that a lot of attorneys, a lot of closing attorneys out there will not release those funds to the buyer unless they have signatures from both sides. Both the buyer and the seller agree, hey, these funds are going to go back to the buyer. Now, I just did a whole episode last week talking to you guys about how residential real estate can be incredibly emotional, right? And you figure if a deal breaks down or gets terminated, more times than not, there's usually at least one party to the deal, or both, who are incredibly upset, they're angry, they're irrational, they're frustrated. And for you to come to them and say, hey, you mind signing this sheet of paper saying that, hey, you will agree to release those funds to the person that you're angry with for backing out of this deal? Sometimes they may just sign it and say, be done with you, I don't want to see you again. And sometimes they could be a jerk about it and say, you know what? You wasted my time. You did all this stuff. I think I have a right to that money. And they could threaten to take you to court. And even if the contract says clearly that the buyers due those funds, there's nothing to stop them, the seller, from trying to take them to court to recoup those funds back as well for the wasted time. Now, whether or not that's a good idea, it depends in every case. Like I said, there are some attorneys who would say, oh, in this situation, you got a case. And there's others who say, you don't have any right to that money. It just depends. But one thing that we do know is that they do fight it. You're going to spend a lot of time and money before that thing finally gets resolved, right? You got to take it to the clerk of court. If it's over a certain amount, right? If it's over like that $5,000 threshold, that could add a whole other issue into the mix, right? Can it be in small claims court, or is this a much bigger issue? We've seen deals with 20, 30, 50 grand in due diligence, right? Like, or in earnest money as well when they're trying to recoup those funds. Those are things that could take months to resolve, and it could be all kinds of issues. Even though you follow the contract to a T, you could still have to be in a fight for those funds, right? And so you, as the buyer, need to understand those risks that you're taking. You, as the seller, also need to be in understanding how those risks are involved, and know that the contract isn't always going to protect you necessarily. You have to understand what the risks are. And again, a good quality realtor is going to explain that to you and make sure that you're understanding of it. Say, hey, here's the risk that you're going to take. Here's what you're putting up. Here's what could happen. Here are all the different possibilities. And then you have to decide whether you are comfortable enough moving forward in that process or in that deal. There's also a situation that outside of just the traditional contracts, there's also disclosures that are typically out there as well. These are opportunities for the seller to let the buyer know if there's any pertinent information that they need to know about that house. It could be from the agent to the client, letting them know about, hey, these are companies that I partner with, right? If there's any conflict of interest, if they happen to be working with the seller or they work for the same firm as the buyer, any of those different things, those are all included under the umbrella of disclosures. And that can become a very big issue if there are certain things in the deal that can very much impact the way that things are working, but it wasn't properly disclosed to all the parties involved. And so you need to make sure that that's disclosed. In our state, we have property disclosures where you can have an opportunity to kind of learn more about the condition of the property and if there's anything wrong with it. You can't always 100% trust that particular document, and that's where you're going to have to lean on your agent to figure out, like, hey, is this something that we can really look at to gain some more insight on the home? Same thing with lead paint disclosures, mineral rights, and oil, gas, like a lot of these things that most buyers never even think of or know to ask about. It can be a huge change, right? We have a disclosure in our state, the mineral oil and gas rights disclosure, that didn't exist until we had a builder who came from Texas, where they were used to selling lots out there, but keeping the oil rights underneath the ground, right? So if anyone ever struck oil on that land, that builder still had a right to that oil, even if it was on your land, right? That was a very common thing out there in Texas. They came out here and tried to do that in Raleigh. And we said, oh, no, you don't, right? That was not something that we were going to allow. So our attorney general had to step in, and that's where they ended up creating this form for buyers and sellers to basically let a person or a potential buyer know that the mineral oil and gas rights are also conveying with the house and that they have not been sold away, right? That's just one example of many where things can be different from state to state, and that can really impact what a buyer is expecting in that situation. So don't just assume that because things went a certain way for you or for someone you know in a different state, that's how it's automatically going to operate where you're buying now. It changes from state to state. It can sometimes even change from city to city within an individual state. And so these are all things that you need to be fully aware of, and why it's best for you to have a professional in your corner as opposed to trying to go at it yourself. The disclosures, like I said, they can be a double-edged sword. You can't lean on them completely, but they can be a great way for you to have some items that you can look at right out of the gate to know if there's any red flags with that. There's also situations where there might be addendums or attachments added or included with that contract as well. Again, as I said earlier, an agent is not allowed to draft addendums or anything like that to the deal. Only attorneys can do that. And so there are a lot of times where we will hire attorneys, firms will hire attorneys to come in and draft a certain addendum or disclosure that they want to be able to use in a transaction. Again, not all of them are created equal. There are some of them that have, they sound good, but they really don't have any teeth to them, right? There's no way to really hold someone to that certain item. One example I think of in this is that when the market was really hot and crazy a few years ago, there were a lot of buyers who were essentially using what they call an appraisal waiver, where they would say, if this house does not appraise for this purchase price, we are not going to ask you as the seller to come down on your price. Whatever it is, we will pay the difference. That is a very scary thing to put into writing, because you as the buyer, you have no control over what that appraiser may or may not say, right? If the house is listed for $400 and you made an offer for $450, there's no way that you can guarantee that that house is going to appraise for $450, right? If it appraises for $420, right, and you've already said, hey, we're not going to ask the seller to come down the price, you're essentially saying that, hey, if it appraises for $420, we'll pay the extra $30,000 out of pocket. If it appraises for $375, right, there's no floor that people were putting on this, and so they're really kind of putting themselves in a difficult situation. But the weird thing about those types of addendums is that they essentially had no teeth to them, because there was no penalty in place or that you could use to force them to continue to go through with the purchase of that house. It was essentially, at the end of the day, a handshake agreement, right? And so the only way that you could hold them to that word is by seeing how high their due diligence fee was. And so that was the way that you could tell whether or not there was any proof to this addendum or not. But the sellers didn't always understand that, right? Sellers said, hey, it didn't appraise for what they were contracted to appraise it for. They told us up front they're not going to ask us to come down, but here they are asking us to come down on the price. No, we're not going to do that. As a seller, you're completely within your rights to do that, but you can't force the buyer to bring those additional funds to the table, even if you have that signed addendum, right? Because there's no consequence or penalty in place outside of just saying like, hey, we'll wait to see how they can do. And so there's a lot of different things like that. The same thing with purchasing a house as is. There were some buyers who said, hey, we'll buy this house as is and we won't ask you for any repairs. And then repairs came along the inspection came along and they said, oh, well, if we had known this particular item was going to be out there, we would have never agreed to buy it as is. Will you still agree to fix this item? And the seller's saying, well, you agreed to buy this house without asking for any repairs. Why are you still coming back to us? Because that addendum or that contract really doesn't have any ability to force them to purchase the house the way that it is. The only way that you could hold them to their word is by using the other features in the contract, such as the due diligence fee. And so these are all things that you need to understand going into it, is that I don't want you as the buyer to sign an addendum or sign something or receive something from a seller and think that because it's a signed legal document sitting in front of you that you're protected across the board. There's always going to be some level of risk involved no matter what. That's the reason our contracts change every year, because there's always something, there's some loophole, there's some little thing in there that doesn't really change the way that things operate. And even if you are completely within the rights of whatever is on that contract, there's still a very real likelihood that you could end up having to take that person to court, waste time, money, and everything else trying to get them to follow what is in the contract all along. And so I don't say this to scare you into getting into a real estate transaction, but I want you to understand that as helpful as these documents are, right, 90% of the time they're great. They do exactly what they're intended to do, and they help make sure that people are kind of holding to their word. But I don't want you to think that a real estate contract is going to be the complete savior of the deal, right? Is going to protect you across the board. That is rarely ever going to happen. There's always going to be things that you need to be watching out for. And as always, like I said, I want you to lean on your realtor. They're the ones who are in the business day in and day out, dealing with these contracts in theory and in practice, and getting to see the way that they all plays out. So you want someone who can explain that to you, give you a clear understanding of what's at risk and what position you're putting yourself in, and make sure that you have all the understanding that you need before getting into that deal. Don't ever, ever, ever work with an agent and just say, hey, whatever the agent wants me to sign, I'll sign, and I'm not going to question it, and I'll just go along with them. I don't care how good your agent is. They're not the ones that's going to be living in that house. They're not the ones that are going to have their name on that deed. You need to make sure that you understand that information. Same thing goes when you're at the closing table and you're signing all that massive stack of paperwork that the attorney has for you. Right. They're going to give you an idea, like give you an overview of what's happening in there. But if you have questions, ask them. Don't just go along with it because the attorney told you to do so or the attorney told you to sign here. Ask questions for things you don't understand. You need to make sure that you understand this for yourself. So I hope that's helpful for you, give you a little bit more to think about. As always, I'm here to be a resource for you, but have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to y'all next week.